And I also really agree with the point you made around other factors, Brexit, COVID, home working, all these sorts of things. And to a certain extent, a lot of it has driven this outcome-based mentality to come a bit to the fore. But Joe, in terms of IR35, so one of the things that we certainly noticed was the impact that obviously this had on the public sector. Back when it came in 2017 or whatever it was that it came into the public sector. And there was a clear transition and evolution within the public sector about how they definitely adapted more to using SOW as an option of that's how a different way they could get work done. Have you noticed much in the way of differences between the way that the public sector have adapted to it and the private sector are?
I sort of cast my mind back to 2017, and at the time I was actually in a role which was a account management or account directorship role. So part of my day-to-day activity at that time was taking some of our public sector clients through that transition and through that journey. And I think the public sector was faced with a slightly different dilemma to actually what the private sector was faced with, in that they were still trying to access talent, quite often in sectors or occupational areas where they were in direct competition with the private sector. So a good one being tech and IT, for example, where actually it was no longer a level playing field. No. Because actually those workers clearly could continue to work in outside IR35 engagements, long past the point at which it was possibly not an option via a traditional route in the public sector. And again, if you look at some of the clients who perhaps are most disadvantaged in that space, who have private sector should we say comparisons, so be they people, for example, who regulate financial markets, who might be drawing on the same types of skills as actually the financial services sector in the wider area. Or you look at, for example, the dichotomy between the private and public sector within media, for example, and traditional broadcast media, for example. And I think it very much created actually much more of a catalyst in the first instance within the public sector to be quite creative about how they carried on accessing that talent, which perhaps wasn't something, when you think about the kind of should we say the stereotypes that you hear about the private and public sector in terms of perhaps their appetite for risk or innovation, it perhaps didn't naturally fall where you thought it would have done. We had quite a large number of clients, and some of our biggest clients when the private sector side of things hit, who were financial services, who, for all the reasons that you would think of financial services, took quite a risk-averse approach to it. So again, being quite dictatorial about how they actually were proposing to engage with the market. So I think we definitely saw a difference in terms of almost kind of a needs must attitude to risk in terms of adopting statement of work programs. That said, I think for private sector organisations, I'm not sure that IR35 has been the driver for what we've actually seen as being the progression into, in particularly SOW activities. I think genuinely there has been, it's not all been about access to talent who want to engage in that way. It's actually been much more focused around wanting certainty of outcomes and certainty of price and certainty of the level of risk that they have on particular contracts. And I kind of think the access to talent thing is, up until this point, has possibly been a bit of a side gig for them in terms of why they've chose to adopt those types of principles. And and we deliver a lot of SOW programs within the tech space, and and obviously just the nature of the types of projects and transformation programs that are ongoing in that area, they lend themselves to meaty, chunky projects or programs that fit very well within statement of work sort of parameters. So as I said, I think we've probably had different push and pull factors as to why the two sectors have kind of gone down that route at sort of probably equally pace, if that makes sense, or equal pace, but probably with different reasons in the outset.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying. As you've highlighted a very good point there in terms of the public sector being forced to be more agile and adopt innovation, whereas within the private sector, it was kind of, like you say, it was a level playing field effectively. And so there was the opportunity to just say, I'm not going to spend the time and effort thinking about how to do things differently. I'm just going to say, no, we're not doing that because there's risk involved in it. And a lot of organizations in, financial services, pharmaceutical, highly regulated industries did take that type of approach, big companies. But I wonder, I don't know whether this is anything that you guys are seeing, but I've always sort of thought to myself, there'll be like a multi-stage approach to it in the private sector, because what will happen is people will take a mandated approach initially. Some companies will do that, and that will satisfy the immediate regulatory requirement. But at some point, they are going to find that stuff is not getting done, because if they haven't adapted, and obviously the smart ones that have adapted, they're riding through that. But for companies that haven't adapted and have taken a really strong arm approach with just a very kind of blinkered view, surely they're going to run into problems at some point.
Johnny, I think the private sector comes in many forms. So to some of Joe's points earlier, some just took the blanket approach because of risk. Some companies could actually afford just to say, actually, they're all inside because they could afford it. So some of your big tech players, media players, investment banks could afford that change and did not want to lose that talent. So running into that problem, they kind of, I guess, if you like, circumnavigated that or de-risked that up front by saying, inside IR35, they're all inside IR35, but let's add 30% to the pay. They actually compensated the contractors immediately. And I think right now, as you know, because as much as an impact on companies, the IR35 was quite an impact on people/companies that were used to operating in a certain way and possibly took home a certain amount of money that they were used to and adapted their lifestyle to that. So they also had to go through an adaptation period. But the candidate market as it is now, or the skills market as it is now, or even if you try and get a tradesman, Johnny, or anybody actually, the skills or services, BPO, etc., it's also busy. I think companies have just got to adapt. If they listen to us and we can sort of share the challenges to the resource market, however that's engaged, they'll recognise they'll have to pay more if it really is inside. You don't want to get on the wrong side of HMRC, or they will look to an alternative route if we can get a project delivered on time at a certain price. But it's that candidate in the skill set market, I think, means they're having to possibly pay more rather than adapt, because I think the adaptation has happened.